I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder, the podcast where we try to find order in our mad world. It's not a podcast, it's the podcast.
I couldn't agree more, Alex. So this week, in addition to trying to create some order, we're going to take listeners' questions. We're going to tell some stories from our lives with the restart of the school year. We're going to talk about our summer breaks. And then that very touchy topic, our feelings about the state of the U.S. presidential race.
Dun, 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 dun.
Alex, you are just back from Georgia. I am very jealous. I wouldn't mind some kisi in a kvevery. But tell us, how was the McCain Forum?
For listeners, this is an event that has been going on for 8 years in September in Tbilisi that brings together friends of Georgia or Ukraine or who are engaged in the region from the US and across Europe to brainstorm on the region and the challenges and what we should be doing about it all. And I hosted a panel on elections in the EU. And my 3 takeaways were, first of all, for the first time ever since I personally have been engaged in Georgia, which is over 10 years now, the mood in Georgia is incredibly bleak because they are on a pivot point in their own politics. For the first time in 20 years, they have a government which seems to be on the point of turning Georgia definitively away from trying to join the EU and NATO and its Western and democratic path and opting to go back into the Russian sphere of influence. They have elections coming up in October, and our Georgian friends think this is absolutely their last possible chance for Georgian people to register unequivocally that they remain committed to democracy, to democratic values, and they want to remain aligned with the Western world. They do not want to be sucked back into Russia's orbit. But they're very worried about the elections being rigged. And the Georgian government, the current incumbent Georgian government, not only has it introduced a law that clamps down very heavily on civil society, but they also, just 2 days before the conference began, announced that if they win the election, they are determined to destroy permanently the opposition by running lawsuits and putting what they call criminal opposition figures into prison, which is just mind-blowing. So the first thing is what's going on in Georgia. And then expanding out a bit, we then talked about the region and how Russia is putting pressure, not just in Georgia, of course, but the state of the war in Ukraine. And the mood amongst those attending was that we in the West have become far too complacent and smug and self-satisfied and congratulating ourselves about how much aid we've given to Ukraine and what a great job Biden's done in rallying this coalition of over 30 countries committed to supporting Ukraine. But as one speaker said, our aid is still not sufficient and not strategic. There are too many restrictions on the weapons, how Ukraine can use them. And another speaker said, we still haven't, in fact, this was a British politician, he said we need to shift our mentality from avoiding escalation to actually winning. And then my last point is then expanding again from Georgia to Ukraine to this sort of geopolitical situation, that what's happening in Georgia and what's happening in Ukraine are all arenas of a wider global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism.
Some might say it's a struggle between order and disorder.
Yeah, and actually the word disorder came up a lot. In fact, there was a whole session on a world in disorder. But this is the issue, and speaker after speaker was saying, we have to understand these aren't isolated incidences. What's happening in the Middle East, spurred on by the hand of Iran behind it. What's happening in the South China Seas and the Indo-Pacific with China muscling in. China's efforts to gain traction in Africa, and then, of course, the war in Ukraine and Russia's pressure in Europe. And these are all interconnected, and we are not enough of our leaders are joining the dots or willing to face up what that means.
Because they've got to listen to more podcasts like this, Alec. I've been saying how connected these matters are for over a decade, and I think our listeners can connect the dots and read the roadmap better. A few of the things you said about Georgia, the state of doom and gloom, and then Western complacency really resonate with what I wanted to talk about, which is I've been back in the States for a couple of weeks, and maybe I'm just a contrarian, but while most people are feeling the quote-unquote positive Kamala momentum, I am extremely uneasy, and it just gets worse and worse every day. I see complacency in the Democratic Party, and then I see real doom and gloom in the center of the country. And that's, of course, not at all what people are feeling in Brooklyn and in their fundraisers in the California Bay Area and elsewhere. So maybe there is something about me which is a contrarian, but from my studies, I know that these 9 weeks from Labor Day to polling day, that's the only thing that matters. And what I've been noticing is that since Harris has been inserted in the race, obviously the Dems poll numbers are better, we're winning in more swing states. That's all great, alhamdulillah. But there's been a polarization on how people are responding in the age, gender, ethnicity to Kamala. And I have this pit of my stomach feeling that this is going to be a rerun of Hillary. I remember in October 2016, when all of a sudden Trump's poll numbers came back after the Access Hollywood tape, everyone said he was dead in early September. He was dead. Hillary had run away with it. And then his poll numbers came back up and up and up. And then I had this feeling. And I would go to the office and I would play backgammon and I would give a lecture at a think tank. And I just felt viscerally bad. And I'm going to say to the listeners that in my kishke, in my guts, I have this feeling that she's not landing with middle-aged voting white male Democrats, and that she might be coming across as fake, inauthentic, and a poor communicator. And I had this feeling watching that Dana Bash interview of doom and gloom. As soon as there was that thing oh, but you said you would ban fracking and now you're for fracking, and you said that you would this and now you're that. And I want to keep an open mind. I knew, and I've said on the pod, that I preferred Gretchen Whitmer or Amy Klobuchar or even Pete Buttigieg. But I'm okay with Harris. I've never been anti-Harris. But I have this idea that she's going to be perceived by the right as into identity politics. She's going to be perceived as a strident, uppity female lawyer with brown skin who speaks in an elitist way. And that everything that she says is focus grouped to death. I wish I could say I was upbeat. I wish I could say I felt a mega ordering vibe. I felt that a month ago when Biden stepped down. I was like, oh, this is great, and it's all happening, and she's great. And to unlock why I could feel this way, I want to make a profound contrast with Starmer and Kamala. On the surface, they're literally mirror images of each other. They're both public prosecutor centrists who have pivoted more from a left-wing origin to more centrist-like policies the more they get into politics. They both have lower middle-class origins. They're both married to Jews. They both believe in strong support for NATO. They believe in the transatlantic alliance. They both believe in Israeli security as well as Palestinian self-determination. And yet, and I cannot explain why, Starmer strikes me as authentic and modest, maybe not a great orator, but a legitimate, authentic, modest communicator. And Kamala strikes me as polished and slick and triangulated. And I'm going to vote for her anyway, and I was going to vote for anyone that they would choose. I have this fear because when I remember Hillary, she's like, oh, that was a very intellectual and very good answer. But it seemed extremely prepared, and it seemed kind of rigid. And now I'm getting that feeling the more I interact with her. So we are going to be back to unpack the debate. I'd like to pretend that this debate is not that important because they already had the important debate and that's over. And, oh, she's going to be fine. It's all going to be great. But I have this gnawing feeling that if she doesn't eviscerate Trump in this debate, make him look like a buffoon and wrong, and also seem normal and jovial and every womany, if she doesn't do all of that, which is very difficult to do, I'm going to have to run for the hills. And when I say run for the hills, I mean run for the hills of Hampstead. Only in the hills of Hampstead can I find myself away from all of this.
Oh my gosh. Well, Jason, I think you're right to feel this election is absolutely not over. Americans are discovering that they can run a campaign in a very short time. And I think there's many twists and turns likely or possible still ahead. And so the polls are too tight. In the swing states, Harris currently has a slight edge. But I agree with you. We underestimate Trump. He has a very solid base. And I will just make 3 observations about the race. One is that the scrutiny of Kamala is far more rigorous than the scrutiny of Trump. So Kamala says something and everybody dissects it and parses it. And why isn't she more specific on policy? Or that seems a little inconsistent with what she said. Trump spouts gibberish at every single rally. And nobody sort of reports on that. And it's the same when it was Biden. You know, Biden's too old, Biden's doddery, Biden's mind may be going. I mean, Donald Trump, he also has mental lapses and is not a young, fit person and may not even last 4 years in office, in which case we face getting JD Vance. But somehow that's not getting the same level of attention. And I don't know if it's a rerun of this, the media being afraid of being accused of being biased or too mainstream, or just doing this thing that they did in Brexit as well, that for every supporter of Remain, you had to find a supporter of Brexit and you had to be balanced. So one, I think the media scrutiny is a little bit unbalanced. Secondly, I think the groundwork is being laid very systematically in certain states to allow the Republicans to allege that the election was rigged. And I'll just give an example that in the state of Georgia, there is something called the so-called Election Integrity Project, which is staffed by people who are overtly election deniers who believe the 2020 election was stolen. And their role is to go and attend all the polling booths, and they only have to launch one objection for it to have to be taken to court. And they can launch objections in all these polling districts and bog the certification process down in so many lawsuits that the state of Georgia fails to submit its returns.
And we've discussed this. They've been preparing this, the Republicans, for years in conquering state houses, in pre-launching legal complaints. It's a slow-moving coup that they're going to dispute the results.
So that's the second thing. Actually, I have 4 points. The third point is a little bit like you get shy Tories who didn't want to admit they actually were voting for Boris Johnson. You do get people who don't like to admit they're voting for Trump. So Trump consistently underpolls and outperforms. So that's something to bear in mind. And then finally, there's this issue which has already come up quite heavily in the media over the last couple of days about disinformation. And it's not just Russia sowing disinformation or Chinese trolls sowing disinformation, but it's also domestic actors. And what they're trying to do is sow distrust in the process. And we had that episode, that brilliant episode with Miles Taylor earlier in the year about artificial intelligence also being deployed to confuse people about the elections. So I think it's not just a question of whether Harris can swing it. I feel a little bit more confident about her than you do. I don't think she is like Hillary. I think she's slightly less policy wonkish. I think she comes across as more human and engaging than Hillary did. I agree, you will still get people who bridle at a woman having these opinions, but I don't think she has that Hillary sort of quite negative factor.
You're right. People don't think she's the Antichrist. When I worked at the U.S. Embassy in Muscat in 2004 in Oman, Muscat, Oman, some of the right-wing Marines, and these were people in their late 20s, because the Marines guard the embassy, they would say, you know that Hillary? She's the Antichrist. And this is when she had no role in public life. And it's like some guy from Alabama. And I'm like, really? So that presaged what was going to happen 12 years later. And it's true. No one has had that profound feeling about Kamala to hate her or not. But I want to say anecdotally, of my Democrat voting, middle-aged male backgammon friends, we're talking upper middle class, but not always educated. If they're white men, they tend not to like her. If they're from a minority or they're women, they like her. It's literally the dumbest thing ever. If I talk to a friend and he's a white guy, they're like, you know, I just don't think she's trustworthy, or she doesn't seem whatever. And if they're minorities, they're like, wow, she's all about this empowerment and she represents what we need to be doing. And the reason why I have this pit in my stomach is I'm not the traditional voter. Do you know what I mean? I have 2 master's degrees and I've been in 3 PhD programs and I've traveled to 70 countries. My views on what she is and is not are not relevant. I have a terrible feeling in my derivative palate. I have been hearing weird things from white men, like people saying, she sounds like you can't understand what she's saying. Or she sounds like she's a robot. And I don't think that.
It's so shocking that that reaction is still coming out. I was in West Virginia and a friend of mine there said, these guys, they will never support a woman and especially not a woman of color. And I was like, how can that be true? How can that be true in the 21st century? Surely we've moved beyond that. But what you're saying, I mean, it is definitely the case that she polls better with women and white men, and it does seem to be men in particular, have this real problem. And I'm also going to share with you a little anecdote, which is that I'm actually a signed up volunteer for the Harris-Walz campaign. So I have been doing a little canvassing on the doorsteps. I've only been out 2 days so far, so this is not really a scientific poll, but it's an anecdote, and take from it what you will. It did not go well. I'm in a neighborhood which is professional, educated, middle classes, and a lot of government workers. It's trended ever more Democrat. So I kind of thought I was going to be on pretty safe territory here. And I sort of confidently walked up to each doorstep. The first door I knocked on was a supporter of Robert Kennedy Jr., the sort of wacko renegade Democrat who doesn't believe in vaccinations, has embraced all sorts of conspiracy theories, and has now endorsed Donald Trump. The next person I had a great conversation with was a really nice young guy, and he said, I'm not voting because I don't support their stances on Israel and Gaza. And he was someone who'd been taking part in demonstrations, expressing concern about what was going on in Gaza for months and months and months. And we had a long conversation, and he was a delight to talk to. And I tried to say to him, look, you're definitely not going to get a better outcome with Trump. He agreed he wasn't a supporter of Trump, but he said, I just don't know if I can support this lot. And yes, Kamala has said a few nicer things, but I need to see action.
This was a white man in Virginia?
Yeah. Then I had a woman who was an artist, and I thought, this is going to be great. She's, Trump is surely absolute anathema to her. He's such a Philistine and he's so misogynistic. And she said, I just don't know. I'm undecided. And I said, why are you undecided, if you don't mind my asking? And she said, I just don't like the way Kamala was appointed to this position, that there wasn't a proper process. And she said, and I also think the Democrats have gone too extreme. When I probed a little bit, she sort of hinted, we sort of skirted around it because I didn't want to make her feel too uncomfortable. But basically, she really doesn't like all the identity and gender politics. And she feels very uncomfortable about it. And she teaches in schools, and she's seen how certain views are cancelled and you have to be very politically correct. And she just doesn't like it. And again, I had a really lovely conversation with her. I chatted to her for about 30 minutes, and she totally agreed that Trump was awful. But she said, but I don't know. I did 2 days of canvassing. I did not meet a single person who said, yep, I am solidly in the Harris camp. In McCain, Virginia, a Democrat suburb.
Alex, I am going to be burrowing underneath the hills of Hampstead to create my refuge there. I don't trust the polls because of the shy Trump voter phenomenon that you referenced, and because people need to be motivated enough to turn out. So I tell just another anecdote from an RFK supporter. I played backgammon with a few black individuals, generally very educated, obviously smart guys. They're playing world-class level backgammon. Chatting with the guy, what do you think that RFK dropped out? I'm not going to vote now. I'm like, really? You were not supporting him, were you? It's like, yeah, of course. Fauci didn't tell us all the stuff about the vaccine and his connection to the vaccine companies. And I was like, okay, but there are more issues than this. This isn't the one issue, right? I mean, you like the fact that we're supporting the Ukrainians or whatever. He's like, no, I don't like that. RFK was going to speak truth to power. I don't like Trump. I just want to be clear. I don't like him, and he's a racist. And he's anti this and anti that. And he's not a good guy. But he's going to do what he thinks is best for America. I don't know about this Kamala. You know what I mean? When you don't see it coming, that's when it really gets you. It's like a gut punch. I'm not looking forward to November, but instead of having this be a whine-a-thon, because I get into that whiny mood very easily, and I apologize to the listeners, why don't we take some listener questions? And I just want to toss out here to the mega orderers, the reason that I wanted to get all of these complaints and concerns out there is because I've been seeing the Nate Silvers and the 538 and MSNBC talking about how great we're doing. Do you know what I mean? And all the momentum. And I felt the need, because what are we? We're minor public figures. As my friends tease me, I'm a Y-list celebrity. I felt the need to use my position to present a corrective. But the listeners are more interesting than us. Tell us what they have to say, Alex.
All right, so we've had some great questions. Thank you so much for people who have put them in. We try and address as many as we can. This one comes from Guillermo, and I'm going to put this one to you, Jason, which is, what could the role of diaspora integration policies be in the path to order the disorder? You on the show have talked about migrants, and some of your interviewees are expats themselves. You have also talked about diasporas, their characteristics, and their influence in their new states. However, I feel that there is a gap in the study of the role of receiving country governments as ordering players through doing better to integrate these migrant groups. And I'd like to know your opinions about it. What could or should they do? Are they doing as much as they can? And if no, why not? So I think the point here is, I remember we had a great episode with Dr. Sarkisian, former president of Armenia, who was talking about how his country is failing to take advantage of the fact there are very influential Armenian scholars and doctors and scientists all around the world that are a tremendous resource for Armenia. And so sometimes countries of origin don't make as much use of their diasporas. But this question comes at it the other way round. Are we, the receiving countries, doing as well as we should to integrate visitors and migrants to our country? So, Jason, over to you.
Guillermo, I am very happy that you are a mega orderer. This is a fantastic question. It's actually something I've been thinking about quite a bit, as over the summer I was in Sweden, in London, in various spots in France, and in New York, New Jersey. I am drifting a little bit more socially conservative on the migration topic because of the things that I've seen upset people in places like Clacton-on-Sea and with the vote for Le Pen in southern France. I'm noticing the extent to which the native-born and the foreign-born don't seem to be living in the same parts of town. They don't seem to frequent the same restaurants and the same shops in lots of these places. So in Sweden, in the UK, in France, in America. You could see that there's some kind of deintegration happening across the West, that the native-born and the non-native-born are maybe having fewer social interactions than they did when I was a kid. One of the things I'm really proud about as an American is that where I grew up in New York and in central New Jersey, we didn't ask people where they were born. People of different origins blended together, and they very much passed what the English called the cricket test, which is if you watch cricket and you root for England, you're English. Where I was from in central New Jersey, everyone passed the Thanksgiving test. They celebrated Thanksgiving, they cooked American food, they watched American football. You were American to go. It didn't matter where your parents or grandparents happened to be born. In my going around this summer, I was seeing, particularly in the suburbs of Stockholm, you would be in one suburb where everyone is white, and as soon as you go to another suburb, it's all different minorities. And the distinction was so sharp. And that makes me think they must be doing something wrong in Sweden if, for a whole range of socioeconomic reasons, the non-native born are all clustered in their area. So I then have had my eyes open to this here in America, and I feel like some groups and some situations are better for assimilating. I'm going to give a gold star for Asian Americans in the US. I don't know why, but every Asian American in the next generation, when you meet them, they're highly integrated. They have the sports and fashion and consumption habits of the milieu that they're in. And I'm not sure in Britain that applies to British Asians. They may have different neighborhoods and different accents even into the next generation. And their, for example, food consumption or store shopping habits. So it can't be the fault of the Asians, because the Asians that go to New Jersey and the Asians that go to the West Midlands come from the same place in the subcontinent or wherever. It has to do with the assimilation. So America is probably a little bit better at this in providing those opportunities to assimilate than Britain, or certainly better than Sweden or France. I think that continental Europe is probably worse at this than the UK, and the UK is worse at it than America. But I wonder if we are getting worse at it over time, because when I was a kid, I felt like there were more integrative processes happening. And I'm wondering if there could be rewards for passing tests, absorption classes, like in Israel. People go to Ulpan, they learn Hebrew, but they also learn Israeli culture because they're coming from Argentina and Russia and wherever. And that helps them get more elite jobs and helps them, master the language. I wonder if in America and in the UK, we could have a cultural and an assimilative component. And I hope that doesn't come across as patronizing, because I don't mean it to be patronizing. I just mean that when we see the success that the AFD has put up in Thuringia and in Saxony, I want to head this issue off in advance. And I want assimilation to work, because I think that we need more migrants and we need more assimilation.
Yeah, this is a really difficult issue. I agree with you that it's easier to assimilate in the US than in Europe or in the UK. But I think the reason for that is because the US is a country of immigrants. Everybody, except for the original Native American inhabitants of the land, has come from somewhere else. They have all crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific. And America is an idea. It's not an ethnic race. So yes, the first settlers tended to be white or white European, and Judeo-Christian tradition was very strong, and that has been shifting over time, especially with Hispanic immigration into the US. And that is why I think you're beginning to see a little bit of a backlash now, because the nature of immigration into the US is changing. But the whole point is that everybody is an immigrant. Europe, ethnically, was white, and everybody who's come in, or a lot of the people who've come in, are non-white. And so you have a kind of somebody who is a blood Brit and someone who's come in from somewhere else and has a different colour skin. And it's too simplistic to say everybody who notices that is therefore a bigoted racist. It just means it's harder because you have the native-born population, all of whom were white, and everybody else who's come in is a different race. And so you get that tension. The other challenge you have that's often commented on, for example, with regard to people from the subcontinent who've come into the UK or who have gone to the US, the Indian American population in America is amazingly successful. They're graduates of the most amazing tech colleges in India, and then they come across to Silicon Valley and they are hugely successful. And the Indian American community here in the States is unbelievably successful, high-tech, doing extremely well. The people who came from the subcontinent into the UK were fleeing partition or coming in and were the sort of poorest and most desperate from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, and who have therefore had to fight much harder to be integrated, who were less well educated, who did not necessarily speak English, who were resented by the local white population, so tended to live in sort of enclaves where they felt more commonality. And so they were never integrated in the same way. And there's always been that difference. But I agree with you, we can't ignore this issue. It's really hard.
I want to say we're going to ignore it at our own peril. We can't tell Brexit voters or Trump voters, don't feel that change. Don't feel the sense of dislocation that in your own neighborhood, the racial and linguistic and sometimes religious component of the population has changed. All I could tell them is don't vote for stupid policies that aren't going to fix anything. Because the policies on offer by Farage or Trump, they're not going to address the labor shortage. They're not going to address inflation. And most crucially, they're not going to address Guillermo's question, which is how do we assimilate them better?
After the break, we're going to be taking a few more listeners' questions.
Mega orderers, wanted to tell you guys about another podcast that I really like, The Jordan Harbinger Show. We're really fortunate to have Jordan as a guest later this year. He is a superstar. His show features in-depth interviews with some of the world's most fascinating minds. And what Jordan brings to the pod is a cool, calm Californian energy, talking about tech regulation, but then also relationships and some self-help advice. He also speaks with some of the most fascinating minds out there, like Jamie Metzel and Bill Browder. It's really a must-listen for any of you mega orderers out there. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I want to hear what Joe has to say. Joe has said, given Starmer's majority, should he be brave and say that Brexit has been a disaster for the UK economy and that we're just doing it? We're just going to rejoin the single market. Would the boost to GDP that would then ensue help face down the far right's disorderer lovers?
I think Starmer cannot do that. He does not have a mandate to overturn the commitment he made in the run-up to the election, where he was explicit and his ministers were explicit that there is no intention to join the customs union or the single market. And I think if he just did a complete 180 turn, it would absolutely, completely confirmed the impression of some voters that politicians are absolutely untrustworthy. I do not think he has a mandate to do that. I think he has boxed himself in incredibly unwisely on this. And I do wish he would make the case more clearly for why Brexit is a problem and is not ever going to work well. I do not like the fact that he campaigned on the idea that they would just make Brexit work better. I think they made a critical mistake in not saying there were flaws in this process and in this concept right from the word go, that we were never going to be able to renegotiate trade deals that would be as good as what we had before. And the new trade deals that we're signing with countries, for example, in Asia, are never going to replicate what we lost in our free trade with our biggest neighbours, the biggest trading bloc in the world, the EU. So I do wish he would be more honest about all the problems of Brexit, but I don't think he can just ignore and just plough ahead and say, I'm just going to do a complete 180 and we're now going to rejoin the single market. I don't think they can do that. The other thing I would like for this government to do is stop pretending that the road to a reset with Brussels goes through Paris or Berlin. Both capitals, Keir Starmer has just visited, and there is obviously an effort to get relations on a friendlier footing, but no amount of bilateral tinkering around the edges and signing of mini cooperation deals with individual European countries, they are not going to get around the fact that if we want to restore good relations and trade with the EU, we have to go through Brussels. And I do worry that Starmer is being very disingenuous in pretending that Brexit can ever be made to work really well, and in pretending that he is not below the radar trying to improve cooperation with the EU. I think he should be more honest that there are certain aspects of the deal that are absolutely wrong and he is determined to change them. But I don't think he can just declare, but we're just going to rejoin the single market. He's going to have to make the case. He's going to have to work on individual things and gradually build up public support. For that reason, I think they should take advantage when opportunities arise, like the EU is open to the idea of a youth mobility scheme. They are open to the idea of the UK rejoining the Erasmus education programme. And I think Starmer is still running a little bit scared of the populist press and being worried of being accused of caving into Brussels.
Yep.
So I think there's definitely scope for more honesty, but I don't think he can just do a complete U-turn.
Honesty is the best policy, Alex. That's what my parents told me when I was 4 years old. I, of course, would like him to face down the Eurosceptic haters, explain all the benefits of the common market, but he can't do it overnight. They just have to not run scared from the tabloids and from making the case. So yeah, there's been setbacks that he's faced at his poll numbers in his first 50 days. That largely came from the riots and from warning that the budget would include tax rises. If he's going to face more setbacks, he might as well just be bold. You know what I mean? And say, these are the benefits we can have from doing this youth mobility scheme. These are the benefits from this. I'm sorry we can't do the common market all at once because in our manifesto we said we wouldn't, but we are going to do this and this and this. I don't want him to fall into what I'm going to call the Camelot trap of being so bland and poll tested and avoiding difficult questions. So I think he can do better. I still love the guy, but you're right. He's never been straightforward about Brexit. And this is something that I think, sadly, we're going to have to come back to again and again. And speaking about the neo-populist right and all of the disadvantages that it causes, Oliver W. asks, a theme again in Germany is that AfD support is negatively correlated with unemployment. Seems uncorrelated with income, but is correlated with age and education. Essentially, the older you are and less educated you are, the more likely you are to be an AfD or populist voter. Should we look at the education system, both youth and adult, to counter the populist threat? Alex.
Actually, Jason, I'm going to let you have a crack at this one. What do you think?
I agree. lack of education and mystical thinking are at the core of neopopulism. And you need education, particularly in civics, on how to diagnose conspiracy theories, how to read a real newspaper. But to my mind, this comes back to the immigration assimilation question that we took at the top from Guillermo. And in Germany, just like elsewhere in the Western world, people over a certain age, say over 55, they grew up in a land that was more culturally homogenous than it is now, with different ways of consuming media than they have now. And it's not wrong of them to be like, I don't want to have to use Apple Pay on my phone. I don't want to have to get the two-factor authentication texted to me. I want to see familiar faces when I go out to the diner. I'd like to eat familiar food and not have to not know how to pronounce things on the menu in my own town. I don't want to stigmatize those people as racist. They are probably feeling boxed into a corner. And what's unfortunate is that the neo-populists don't give them real solutions. They say some BS like the Mexicans are all rapists, which is, of course, a lie and hateful. But it plays on an impulse which is just one of disorientation. And the older you are and the less educated you are, the more you can be manipulated by a shyster like Farage or one of these lunatics who works for AfD. I mean, it turns out that they're all on the take from Russian money. They're skimming money off the top of the party themselves. It's a shame that people can be manipulated, but it does seem in today's media landscape, if you're over the age of 60 and you don't have a university degree, you're more likely to be manipulated.
Yeah, but then I wanted to come back on a second point that Oliver W. made, which is about, in contrast to Germany, in the UK, the share of reform support is highest amongst youth, and actually young people are attracted to radical change. So I think the pattern is not entirely straightforward. I don't think we can say it's just an older generation. And actually, I was quite surprised by the observation that AfD was particularly appealing to an older generation. I thought there were quite a few younger voters involved in that as well. But I'm going to take us back to a discussion that we had at our forum in Tbilisi. And a Czech politician there was talking about why populism and extremism are gaining such traction across the EU. And she said it's because politicians are thriving and exploiting on this culture of fear, and they are deliberately fear-mongering, as you said, painting all Mexicans as rapists or criminals. And we don't have a set of leaders with the courage to face them down. They either try and pander and appease the right wing, which is what we're seeing a little bit in the UK with the competition to become the new Tory party leader. Instead of countering reform narratives, you have some of the contenders trying to sound more reform themselves, like they're trying to toughen up their rhetoric against immigrants and against human rights. They're trying to fill that space by drifting to the right themselves, rather than just saying, no, actually the message is wrong. We do have an issue with immigration. We recognise people are concerned about people coming across the channel in uncontrollable numbers. We understand that, and we do need to get a grip on it. But we shouldn't be demonising these people. We do need to recognise the situations they've come from. And there aren't simple solutions to this. So it's weaponising fear and a lack of leadership and a lack of courage. So either people try and drift and co-opt the extreme messages, or they do what I fear may happen in Germany and France, where the reaction to the inroads made by the National Rally in France or AfD in Germany is that the centre parties are desperately trying to form coalitions that just keep these people out on the fringes. And in France, they've just appointed Michel Barnier as the new prime minister. Now, I know he's a conservative, and maybe Macron's thinking is that Michel Barnier will sort of be slightly more conservative. It's a sop to those who want to push the country in a more conservative direction. But he is not the National Rally, and he is the quintessential establishment elite politician that I think French voters are fed up with. And he's just sort of put in this sort of total establishment figure, a sort of diplomat, a sort of a polished individual. And I don't think that's the change that French people were looking for. So we need new political leaders who have the communication skills to be able to empathize, to identify with the concerns of people who are worried about immigration, who are worried about cultural change, to be able to say, yes, we can understand this is unsettling and the pace of all these changes is very unsettling. But the solution is not to demonize the new arrivals or to weaponize this. Here are some practical solutions, but it's going to take time, and sort of offering tangible solutions. And that's what we need. And actually, I would say to their credit that Keir Starmer and his team, especially his new Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, are actually trying to do that. They're trying to hire more case officers to process asylum claims more quickly. They are trying to get deals to repatriate immigrants who fail to be granted asylum. And they're trying to work with the French to beef up cooperation across the Channel. They're coming up with pragmatic solutions.
To the next question. James C. says, I have a question and request for help in how to formulate a response when a colleague who I occasionally engage in conversation about Ukraine sends me a link like the one below. We're going to put this in the show notes. The basic premise of the link is that the Ukraine war is all about the money. Money for minerals and resources and NATO on the border, and that some big global elite, the big they are running things. I only watched a small part at the beginning of this crazy video, but I've heard some similar points from him, in other words, my colleague, before. I'm more in line with your thinking, Alex and Jason. Occasionally, I wish I had better knowledge to counter these arguments. I'm looking for resources or ways to challenge this view. What are your thoughts, and could you point me to any resources to counter these views? Alex.
Thank you. That's a really great question. And it exemplifies the problem with misinformation as well, because we get fed so many different narratives about Russia and Ukraine that it is very easy for some people to go down a rabbit hole and embrace some of these conspiracy theories. And it is difficult to know how to counter some of the more ludicrous narratives out there. So I watched the video. The basic premise of the interview was it included a clip interviewing Senator Lindsey Graham, who was trying to make the case for why we needed to stand up for Ukraine. And one of the points he made is, and by the way, Ukraine has a lot of precious minerals and resources, and we don't want these to fall into the hands of Russia or China. And the hosts of this show said, there you are, it proves all this war about is it's just about minerals and resources. Well, first of all, of course, the interview was taken completely out of context. It was part of a wider interview where Lindsey Graham was also talking about we need to stand up for Ukraine. They are a sovereign country. We signed the Budapest Memorandum. This is a struggle to support a country that is democratic and trying to assert its sovereignty. And there were a whole host of other arguments that Lindsey Graham has consistently made. But because they isolated this snippet, they then said it's all about money. But I think when you get these questions, I think what you have to do to your colleague is say, just, whoa, wait a minute. You're saying that we started this war and we are meddling in Ukraine so that we can grab their resources. Well, let me ask you, which country invaded Ukraine? Have we invaded Ukraine? No. Of course, the Russians have invaded Ukraine. Do we have boots on the ground in Ukraine? No. Have the Ukrainian legitimately elected democratic government begged and pleaded us to support them? Yes, they have. So you just have to sort of put the facts back.
Yeah, Alex, just to jump in, I love the clarity here. It's like this is the simplest thing that people who are pre-language can understand, which is that the one who invades the other's country is at fault.
So the other thing is, NATO is at fault because we have provoked Russia, and Russia is defending its legitimate sphere of influence. But this sphere of influence narrative is also a completely toxic and disingenuous one. I mean, does the UK have a right to Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, because once upon a time, the UK England occupied Ireland and we were a colonizer. Does that mean Ireland is forever part of our, inverted commas, legitimate sphere of influence? No, Ireland is an independent country and they have the right to do what they like. Ukraine is an independent country. Russia does not have a historic claim to any of these countries. They were part of a Soviet empire which no longer exists. And Ukraine is a country in its own right, and its own people do not want to be Russian. So for our very last question for this week, we're going to go back to a more domestic issue. We've spent a lot on international politics. This one is going to be about the NHS, and it comes from Sati, who says they are a super fan of the show. Thank you. As an optimistic mega orderer doctor within the NHS, I am increasingly puzzled as to why a nationalised health system struggles, despite all the potential benefits such as economy of scale and standardisation. Demand always outstrips supply, waiting lists are huge, and young doctors are leaving the country. Perhaps the grass is greener on the other side, e.g. fee-paying patients at the point of care. So I have a question for you. Is universal healthcare doomed for failure in a consumerist society?
Oh man, our mega ordering listeners are so bright. They have such great questions. Sati, I sure hope it isn't doomed, but my experiences do say otherwise, so I resonate with what you're saying. I'd like to think in an abstract way that the economy of scale, the ability to bargain collectively with drug companies, the ability to standardize information flows from medical trials, all of that should lead to better outcomes. However, my experiences in the UK health system over the past 2 years have been positively abysmal. I had a rash. I call. They're like, oh, in 5 days you can have a phone appointment. The phone appointment comes, they don't call back. I call, oh, we're sorry, it wasn't a priority. I don't know why that is the case, but maybe you're right. It's a simply supply-demand / underfunding issue, and that with the loss of EU workers due to Brexit, and then the loss of high-skilled British doctors to Australia and elsewhere due to better pay, it seems that there's nothing that can be done. But I don't accept that, because if the NHS is proven to be unmanageable, unworkable, and private pay-for healthcare systems deliver better outcomes per dollar and per patient, then the very idea of the state sector working could be dealt a crushing blow. And I think that history tells us that it's not that way. Scandinavia used to have some of the best healthcare systems in the world, paying less than 8% of GDP on their healthcare. And America pays around 20% on its private system and has worse outcomes than the Scandinavians or French, who are paying between 7 and 9%. However, it's important to point out that, as we discussed in our Million Downloads episode with my buddy, Kareem, in Sweden, they no longer have an NHS-style system. They've had a lot of privatizations. So I think the problems with the NHS are not really about privatizations or not privatizations, single payer or not single payer. They're about not having enough workers, not having a good computer system, not making the difficult choices to get it up and running. And it's true, if the UK government can't do this and can't make it work, then they should be fired. I would fire any chief executive who has 10% of the British GDP, which is hundreds of billions of pounds a year. If they can't get the 40,000 more NHS appointments and get this thing working, vote them out of office. I don't see why they can't not only do this, but make great British energy, create jobs for young people, put up solar panels, and do all the stuff. I don't need to be in the details, but looking at it from 30,000 feet, it must be able to be fixed.
Well, that's enough from me for this week. If you too want to help order the disorder, you can tap follow right now wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be notified when every new episode launches.
That was more than enough from me. But if for some reason you want to hear me more in written form, please subscribe to our Substack. The link is in the show notes. As always, our producer is the one, the only, the George McDonough, and our executive producer is Neil Fern.
Thank you so much for listening. Keep those questions coming, and I hope you have an orderly week.